Greetings and thank you for tuning in to Walking in Wealth. I'm your host, JD Garnier, and you are listening to KKNOK 75 AM on 107.1 FM radio in New Orleans, or you're tuned into the Melanomics podcast. I hope you had a productive week in your wealth creation journey. And listen, my goal is simple: to help you walk in wealth mentally, physically, spiritually, and financially. To take the things that God has already given you and use those to create a life of purpose, so that wealth is more than just what you acquire. Wealth is who you become. You are the wealth, not your investments, not your real estate, not your business. You are the wealth. And before you have any of those things, you have a unique and specific set of talents, abilities, gifts, ideas, habits, disciplines, and inclinations that form the basis of any and everything that you do in this world. And once you tap into that, you start your wealth creation journey. So again, you are the wealth. Listen, first things first, if you are not following me on social media, please follow me on Instagram at GarnierJD, Facebook at JD Garnier Sr., and subscribe, like, and share the Melanomics YouTube channel. Also, if you are in the New Orleans area, you can tune into my show on Mondays and Wednesdays at 9 o'clock a.m. on KKNOK 75 AM or 107.1 FM radio in the New Orleans area. A lot of things going on in this world. A lot of things going on in this world. And, you know, one of the biggest tricks that the devil ever played is convincing us that he didn't exist. And a lot of times, I don't believe we know who our enemy is. You know, there are two types of warfare. There's physical warfare and there is psychological warfare. But regardless of the type of warfare, all war is based on deception. You know, I spend a lot of time talking about wealth. I spend a lot of time talking about the wealth mindset. But sometimes for us to truly understand our mindset and how to change it, we got to know how we got here. All war is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When we're using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe that we are far away. And when far away, we must make him believe that we are near. That's the very first paragraph in The Art of War. All war is based on deception. And again, a lot of times I think we don't know who our enemy is. Chess is a game of strategy. A lot of people don't know how to play chess, right? It's played on the exact same board as a checkers board. But the difference is chess is a checkers. But for chess, you have to be able to be thinking 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. You have to be able to anticipate. You have to be able to put your head inside of the mind of your opponent. So it's a completely different game. And a lot of times when it comes to our lives, we need to apply the principles of chess. We need to be thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. And if we're not doing that, those things are being done for us. How does this connect to wealth? You know, we talk a lot, and one of the things that bothers me is that we talk a lot about systematic oppression, which I agree with. Right? We talk about it in institutions, criminal justice, financial system, all of that. But we use the word system as if it's something that we can't define, something that we can't put our finger on. And so we say the system is doing this, the system is doing that, but we can never define the system. But all the system is a controlled environment that dictates behaviors. That's it. A system is a controlled environment that dictates behaviors. The government establishes a controlled environment through laws, regulations, customs, culture, so on and so forth. The behaviors are enforced through the media, through school, through social media, through pop culture, so on and so forth. The purpose of the system is to dictate the outcomes. Right? Think about the systems in our body, right? We have our digestive system, right? We know what happens. Food goes in, it has a certain process that happens, and we understand the outcome. Same thing with our respiratory system, right? Well, the same thing applies with systems in society. The systems dictate the outcomes, right? So if you create an environment that is void of resources, that is void of just basic human needs, that is void of economic opportunity, that is void of quality of education, that is clustered, that is aesthetically unattractive, and then you provide easy access to things that are physically satisfying, that are holistically destructive, then you can reasonably determine the outcomes of the majority of the people in that environment. That's all the system is. It is a controlled environment to dictate outcomes. And so if you can create an environment like a ghetto, right, where it is impoverished, it is lacking opportunity, right? It provides easy access to crime and to drugs and to foul things, right? The resources are minimized or they're subpar. If you can create that type of environment in cities across the country, then you can reasonably dictate that the majority of people in that environment are going to make certain choices. And then you can build your entire system around those choices. That's what a system is. The problem is we keep trying to change the system. It's to collectively change behaviors. That's the only way that you could change the system, is to change your behaviors. And the only thing that you have the power to do is change your behavior. But in order for us to understand how to collectively shift our mindset, we have to understand how we got in this position. And so that's what I really want to talk about today. Because sometimes I think we need a history lesson. And people talk about these things in bits and pieces, but nobody really lays it out chronologically. So we can really understand why we are in the conditions that we are in. I don't think people really lay it out. And listen, I don't want to be a statistician with this discussion. I really want to make the point of how things have concurrently worsened for us regarding psychological warfare, and how at a certain point it was clear to us who our enemy was. But over time, and over a multitude of things that have occurred, we've been conditioned completely out of that. See, things don't just happen, right? We don't get to a point today where Economically, as a community, we have not advanced in 50 years. I think we own less than we owned 50 years ago. Our family circumstances are worse than they've ever been, right? We don't tend to marry at a high clip. We have a high percentage of illegitimate children. The children that we do have, they are not being educated properly as a collective. So that immediately puts us behind in terms of competition with other groups for economic opportunities. And so, there were a number of things, right, that need to be improved in our community across the board. That is not to say that there are not highlights. There are things that are progressing. We're opening avenues and creating businesses and opportunities in spaces that we've never have before, right? We are reaching new heights. But the unfortunate thing is that that's just a small group. And so the point is, how do we duplicate that, right? But as the conditions stand today, right, it's about individual achievement. But for us to truly achieve economic power as a community, it has to be about the collective. And so how do we shift that collective mindset? Well, in order for us to do that, we got to figure out how we got here, right? And again, most times people just don't lay this out chronologically. But I think about this all the time because it's like, man, like they really did a number on us. And so in order for us to be able to get out of this, like we really have to understand how we got here. And I think this message is more specifically toward the state of manhood, because I think that's important, because I think that is the catalyst in us changing the conditions in our community, is improving the standard of our men. But there is a reason why the standard for our men has failed to where it's fallen. It didn't just happen by accident. And, I think about my parents' generation. So my parents are, a little bit older. They lived through the Jim Crow time. They remember that time, right? That time period has strong men, period, across the board, regardless of what direction or path they chose. They were men of resilience. And what happened was, during the civil rights era, right, our families were together. I believe it was somewhere toward the clip of over 80%. We married at an 80% rate during that time. During the 70s, what started to happen was, after integration, what started to happen was, now there's this phenomenon called white flight. And I didn't even remember this until recently, but I did my law school thesis on this. And so think about where we at, right? After civil rights, we are now integrated. So we can go into schools and go into communities freely, and there's no laws that can restrict us. So what starts to happen is, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, all of the employment was in the inner city, in factories. It was manufacturing, it was industrial, right? And so a lot of our communities were close enough where we could get employment. Well, after integration, what started to happen is the phenomenon of white flight. And all that phenomenon says is that once neighborhoods reach a certain percentage of Black or African Americans in that community, it would create a snowball effect of white people leaving those communities. And so you can go to any large city, right? And go to neighborhoods that if you talk to people old enough, they'll say, okay, this neighborhood used to be all white, right? And then it suddenly became an all black neighborhood. That's because of that phenomenon of white flight. Because, right, the laws didn't restrict us from moving in those neighborhoods, but people who didn't want to be close to us, they started just moving away. And that's what really created the suburbs. And what happened was industry went with that. And so we went from the industrial age to now the computer age, where now all of these large IBMs and Hewlett Packard and computer companies are now building their facilities out in the suburbs. So what that did to our community is isolate us from opportunity, from employment, from economic viability. Right after integration, we were isolated from economic improvement because all of the employment went away from where we could reasonably transport at the time. Right? Because this is the city. Everybody didn't have cars in the 70s, and people weren't commuting at that time, right? You would catch the bus or you would walk to work. This whole idea of commuting didn't happen until the 80s. And so what happened to our communities, you can go back and look at this, is right after integration, we had this massive unemployment. And you can go and look at what was going on in Los Angeles. You can look at all of these major cities. A lot of the men could not find jobs because, yes, now we could work in those places, but there still was not laws regarding affirmative action at that time. They weren't really enforcing that stuff in the 70s. People could just not hire you, right? We all saw the Good Times James Evans episodes where he just couldn't get a job, and it was obvious why they weren't hiring him. That's exactly what was going on in our communities at the time, right? And so unemployment was rampant. And at the time, our men were used to being the breadwinner, right? We were willing to work, but they shut us out completely, and we were isolated. And so the only small percentages of us that actually had employment were the ones that had the college education to be able to go and work in those suburban facilities, right? The like I said, the Hewlett Packards and all of those computer companies that were coming up at that time. But the rest of us, we were just stuck in the ghetto, right? No opportunity. And so what happens in that situation when you create an environment where you isolate people from economic opportunity? Crime increases because now people are desperate. I talked about chess, right? You don't just go in and force or give things to people. You create an environment where they are desperate. So that's number one. They created a desperate environment. We were isolated from economic opportunity, right? That's when our men started to form gangs. This was in the 70s. They started forming gangs. At first, it was to protect the neighborhood. But then when you realize ain't no opportunity, then you start preying on one another. That's what started happening during that time period. And so now we go from a group of men in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s that were united, that were together, that had respect for one another. Now we're fighting for crumbs because now we've been isolated from opportunity that we were told we could pursue. And so now we become one another's competition. We start to go at one another. This is what was going on with our men in the 70s, right? This is what was happening. And so now to find employment, they're having to travel, they're having to go places. This is what started to break up families. Because now I can't just have my family and go walk 2 blocks or catch the train and get to work. I have to go drive out to the suburbs. Well, we don't have money for a car. I guess I have to figure something out and go and stay there. And this is what started to break up families, right? Then what starts to happen? Let me back up, because we didn't even really talk about how the ghettos got there in the first place. And if you ever want to read a great book on how real estate was used against us throughout history, go and read The Color of Law. Because a lot of people think, ghettos just happened because we just decided to congregate in the worst places, but that's not what happened. Throughout all of the 18 and 1900s, what was really happening was the federal government, local and state governments were utilizing laws and creating ordinances and districts to shift us in the worst parts of a particular city. And so they needed us for labor, obviously, so we had to live somewhere where they would create zoning laws and restrictions and all of these different city ordinances that would essentially direct us to normally the worst parts, the most low-lying, least desirable land of a particular municipality. And that's the only place that Black people could stay. Another thing they used to do is in those particular parts of the city, they also allow for dumping and trash and landfills. And so that's why a lot of times in really poor neighborhoods, you will see junkyards and all these other things, because they were always zoned to be able to do that. They let people just put their worst stuff in our neighborhoods, right? This stuff was zoned for decades and decades ago. Right? It didn't just happen like that. And so another thing that would happen on top of that is that as they were building these other communities, they would withhold federal dollars if they allow Black people to live in those communities. So this is the federal government, right? This is the federal government doing this. And they basically said, if you build this community, if you let Black people in, we're not going to subsidize these loans. We're not going to give you the full faith and credit of the federal government behind these loans. And so they built massive communities, and they were giving homes away to people for nothing. But we weren't able to participate in that growth because of those laws, right? So, I mean, I could go on and on and on about that. But that's how we got in those communities, okay? We were the workers. So we were working at the factories. We were in the industry. We were the skilled labor, right? We were the foremen. We were the heavy machine operators. Well, when we shifted from this manufacturing industrial age to a computer age, and the jobs went to the suburbs as white flight moved away from the city, now those skills were not in demand. Right? So now we don't have the skills of a new society. We're isolated because now those places are 10, 15, 20 miles away, and we don't have vehicles in our community, right? And now we're stuck in the worst parts of the city, right? Where people dump their trash, and there's landfills, and there's all of these other things. So all of these things are going on that right after segregation, right after the civil rights movement, we are in a position where we have nothing, right? We have nothing. This is the start of how our families really started to decline, right? And so then what happens also during that period, right? You have groups like the Black Panthers, right, that are trying to feed people and help people. And then what happens after that, or during that time period? COINTELPRO, right? Right after segregation and civil rights, there is a FBI-sanctioned operation to plant misinformation among Black organizations. So I'm not saying anything that's not historical fact. I'm just kind of creating the chronological order and how all of this stuff came to be. Right? And what it's actually doing to us in real time over the decades. That's really only the picture I'm trying to paint, right? So you do have positive organizations, but the media is used to make them paint them as if they're the most evil possible, right? And they sow discourse, right? They send in moles to infiltrate, right? And to give information and to have some people of us selling drugs, which, hence, in the 70s is when, again, in a time period where now we're in a desperate circumstance, right? We're unemployed at massive rates. The family is breaking up. Now insert drugs into the community, right? This is what was going on, right? So now in the movies, this is where you see the exploitation, right? Everybody's either selling heroin or they're pimping women, right? This is what was going on because our only opportunities now are to exploit one another. And so that's what we're doing in our communities during that time, right? And so the men are destroying each other. We're destroying each other during this time period, right? We trying to get the crumbs that's left over, right? This is all the opportunity they promised us. We're doing what we can to get it. So this is the start of the decline of the man in the household, of the man in the family, is in the 70s, right? These are men that were born in the 40s and the 50s, right? Now they trying to figure it out. Now they trying to, and right, and some of them do have families. Some of them are making it happen. But the point is, this is the start of that decline, right? And so leading up during that time period, we have massive unemployment. We have white flight. All of the opportunities have left where we are. Coming to the 1980s, drugs is rampant in our communities. It's rampant in our communities. Now there's no opportunity, so there's nothing left. So again, what starts to happen is just this rampant decline of opportunity that starts to pit us against one another. I talked earlier about us not really recognizing who the enemy is. We were clear on that in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s. Now it's becoming unclear because we have spent an entire decade preying on one another. So the 70s was the evolution of the gang culture in our communities. The 70s was a real onslaught of drugs in our communities. And the 70s was an isolation of employment because there was white flight going on. So all of this is happening at the same time. And so now the men that were the pillars of the community, the men that were taking care of the family, that were doing what they're supposed to do, now they are in competition with one another. And we are preying on one another for the very small economic opportunity that was available to us at the time. And so these are the psychological games that were played on us, right? It's again, a system is an environment that dictates behaviors. All they did was lay out the environment. That's it. You lay out an environment. You take away resources. You isolate people. You create desperation. I mean, you can do a science experiment on this, right? They do these experiments with mice. They do them with primates, right? You put a group in a room and you start to slowly take resources and eventually they turn on one another. And so this is the picture I'm painting. What I'm saying is that the system is nothing but the environment that was created. Now, who created that environment? Who built that system? We can have that conversation, right? And you can prove it with documents or however. But the point is, all that needs to be created is the environment. And so if you create that landscape, now you create the desperation. Now you offer economic opportunity in the form of preying on one another. This is why selling drugs became so rampant. because it was so lucrative. And although we were preying on one another, that was the fastest way to gain economic viability. So this is the mindset in the 1980s, right? The 70s and the 80s. This is the beginning of an entire fatherless generation. This is the mindset. This is how you get to that, right? You can't just go to certain communities and then start and think that you're going to infiltrate that community with selling drugs to that community, right? That's going to get shut down. But in our community, because our environment was created, that opened the door for us to look at taking advantage of one another. I don't think that would have been possible in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, right? There was a standard that we held. But once you remove the standard by creating an environment of desperation, now you open a door for all of these things. So this is what we were dealing with in the 1980s. Insert crack cocaine via, again, the federal government, right? Iran-Contra. We all know that they used crack cocaine to fund a war, right, at the expense of our communities. And so again, this decimated already desperate people, and it just spread like wildfire. All of this stuff is just historical fact. Again, all I'm trying to do is paint the picture of how we got here. And so now we're at the second generation of men. I told you what happened to the men in the 70s, right? We took away our economic opportunity with white flight right after integration, right? The skills that they had were no longer viable in this new computer age, right? So now that started gangs in the 70s, right? Insert drugs in our community in the 70s, right? Insert discourse among organizations within the community. This is the start of the decline of the man. That's the first generation. In the 80s, as they're trying to assert and adjust to this new economy, figure out, okay, maybe I do have to go and get a college degree. Maybe I need to pursue an education. Just as we're wrapping our minds around what this new economy looks like, insert crack cocaine, right? We all know that was, what I don't understand is there is 40 years of documented evidence that was done to our community on purpose, and we still glorify selling drugs. Like, that just does not make sense to me. It's documented in government files and government documents, in hearings. You can go and look at. We've known this for years, that this was done to us on purpose. It destroyed communities, and we still glorify it. But anyway, the point is, that's how that was able to happen, right? And so again, now you already have the culture of gangs that manifested itself decades earlier. And so now you give them opportunities, right, to again prey on ourselves, because that's the only opportunity that's available, right? Is preying on ourselves, right? That's all we see, because now our environment is desolate. We've been isolated from what's going on in the real world, right? If you grew up in a ghetto community and you never left out that community, you don't know what the rest of the world looks like. You've been isolated from it. And so your mindset is what you see. And so if that environment is controlled, then with reasonable certainty, the outcome of the majority can be dictated. So you're always going to have people that fall through the cracks. I mean, I like to say I'm one of the blessed people that fell through the cracks. I mean, I grew up in uptown New Orleans. We had dope dealers literally right across the street from our house, that wind up getting 20, 30 years in Angola. I was one of the ones that were fortunate enough that fell through the cracks. But when a system is created, they understand that there are gonna be some that that don't adhere, right? You're going to have some that get through, but you can predict the outcome of the majority, right? It's always some that's going to get through, right? They might have an experience that changes their life or get exposed to something, you know, but the majority, the outcomes of the majority can be dictated. That's why a system is so powerful, right? And so now we in the second generation in the 1980s of men who are being either taking advantage of their communities by selling drugs or being victimized by the community of it, the resources being sucked from it. Because even if you weren't selling drugs or doing drugs as a man during that time, if you were living in those communities, you had to make a decision, right? Are you going to stand up to these young guys that you know will kill you at the drop of a hat? Or are you just going to put your head down and go and mind your business and take care of your family, right? That's the decision. So again, so this is the separation of the community, because in the 70s, or even when I was growing up in the 80s, you know, we had respect, right? Even the toughest guys on the block, if the man come out there, if a certain man comes out there, they're gonna show him some respect, right? But once crack and all of these drugs infiltrating our communities, and now these young men are making money, they lose respect for the men who took care of them with their labor, right? And so now there's this intimidation factor that separates the community, because now there's no hierarchy. There's no respect for your elders. There's no manhood, right? So even the men that were in the community now got their voices started to get taken away. The only place that the voice was relevant at that time was in the church, right? During that time. But in the community, the man's voice started to get taken away, because now nobody's respecting the man that's working, right? Well, I'm gonna respect you, Unc. You know, I'm making this. I'm making money. That's what started to happen during this drug era, right? And it just ran rampant. And this is at the same time that, and I mean, you know, we just celebrated the 50th year of hip hop. So, you know, I believe that it's something I grew up on, right? I'm pretty much a child of it, right? It's give me 1 second. Um, all right. My point is, man, I lost my train of thought. I know where we went. Hip hop. Okay. So if you listen to the early music, even the music that's rough, that's rugged, that's talking about the ghetto, is talking about the conditions as if they are unacceptable, right? It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going. If you listen to the lyrics of the early hip hop, even the ones that's rough, that's rugged, they're talking about the conditions in the community as if they are unacceptable, right? That's what's going on in the mid to late 1980s, right? Yeah, we see all of this crack going on. We see all of this killing. We don't like this, right? That's the message that was going on in the late 1980s. So we see these conditions deteriorating, but we're still a community, right? That's when I grew up. I was born in the late 70s. I grew up in the 80s. We're still a community. There's still a hierarchy, right? I grew up, I was very fortunate, right? I feel bad for a lot of young men right now that have resentment for the fact that they didn't grow up without their fathers. I was very fortunate. I didn't grow up in a house with my dad, but my stepdad married my mom when I was really, really young, and he was, one of the best examples of a man that I could have. Um, but I grew up around men, like real men. Everybody in my family, was a man's man. They took care of things. They took care of their family. They had respect, in the community. I grew up around men of all economic statuses, men that were pillars in the community that got money, and men that just worked locally, but they were men. And that's one thing that I think I was fortunate to be around, because I knew men on both sides. Right? Some that lived, respectable lives, and some that were in the streets. Right? We all have a decision to make. But the point is, during that time period, right, our messages were speaking out against this. There was still a voice in our community, even though it was declining and deteriorating. There were men, right? And I was fortunate enough in my family, and as I look back and see some of the experiences of people that I grew up with that did not have the same, just didn't have the same influence, right? We saw each other every day, we played, but at home, the consistency of having a man in the house, right? Having discipline, having structure, a lot of them didn't have that. And when you look back, you can see, or I can see, how fortunate I was. I had it from all ends. Again, I had my stepfather in the house. I still had a relationship with my real father. So I learned a lot of things from him. I had my uncle was a pastor and a very well-known person in the city. I had first cousins. I was around a lot of male authority figures, and I learned a lot at a young age. I watched people. I got an idea about discernment, just watching them operate. And that voice was still prominent in the late 80s and the early 90s. Even as the music started to change, because you did have the element then that started to glorify that lifestyle, right? That's when gangster rap started, right? Ice-T, all of them. You can just see how the culture is shifting. And so now we're glorifying the money-making part of it, right? We see how it can benefit us, but we're not talking about the effects of how it is deteriorating the community. It is detaching us from one another. It's tearing us apart from the inside. That is what was going on in the early 90s. And then we started to make one last push. We started to make one last push for manhood in our community. Does anybody remember the Million Man March? I don't know why nobody talks about it anymore. But we were able to get 1 million black men to travel to Washington, D.C. to meet in the name of togetherness and coming together, because we saw how bad things were getting. Nobody talks about that. They have a movie about it. There's no incidents that happened, no crimes happened. Men from all religions, all backgrounds, all ages, all economic backgrounds traveled to Washington, D.C. for that cause. You tell me we can't come together? Seriously. People don't talk about that. At the same time, what was going on, people don't talk about this, is there was a Crips and Bloods truce in the early 90s. There was a publicized truce of the Crips and Bloods gangs coming together during that time because violence was so bad. So we made a valiant effort in the early 90s to stop the destruction of our communities. This was to me, this was our last stand. This was the last stand of shutting down what we saw coming, the destruction of our community. We got the Crips and Bloods to have a truce. We got 1 million black men together, right? For the sake of togetherness. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about anything but just us coming together, right? You had powerful voices, Fight the Power, Public Enemy, right? You had powerful voices in our community that were talking about the change that we needed to happen. The mindset was starting to shift. Million Man March was 1995. It was almost 30 years ago. And then what transpired as a result of the Million Man March? Nothing. The very next year is when Tupac got killed. And now we have a publicized East Coast, West Coast beef. And I'm not talking about this to talk about pop culture. I'm talking about this to talk about where we were as black men during that time period. We had just made our last stand, right? We're not having this no more. We need to come together. We need to make a change, right? We need to make a change. And right after that, there is this shift in pop culture, in hip hop culture. You can go and do your research of the timing of any of this. I'm not here to debate that. But if you look at the shift after 1995 until now of our music and our culture, and the message went from one of empowerment and information and education to money, cars, clothes, murder, women. If you look at the shift, I'm not saying there wasn't music about that before, but it was a part of a larger genre of hip hop. But what started to happen is that larger genre that included soulful, that included conscious, that included upbeat fun, that included dance, all of these other things that make up who we are, right? That make up what we are about, because we're not just one thing. All of those other things that made up what our culture really was, right? Hip hop culture is about dance. It's about fashion. It's about graffiti. It's about, music. It's about, poetry, lyrics. It's multifaceted. But what started to happen was all of the things that made it up, after that shift, it started to be shifted down into one unified message, a message about our destruction. Period. You can check the time frame of it. It started to become a message of our destruction. So we are in the 1990s, right? I'm telling you where the man was at, right? Where we were as men. We are 2 generations in of the destruction of the man in the family, right? Right during segregation, we were 80% married in our community, right? It was understood that the man is the head of the household, right? that we took care of the business that we needed to take care of. We were respected in our communities, right? Then integration happens, and white flight is an incidence of us moving into neighborhoods, right? And at a certain percentage, there's called a tipping point where once we get to a certain percentage, they white families start to snowball, leave those neighborhoods, right? This was shown all over the country. And what leads with them are jobs, because in the 70s, we are shifting from a manufacturing and industrial age to a technology age, right? To the new computer age. So, we always had secure jobs in the factories in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? We lived in the ghettos, and we just walked to the factory. We were the workers then, right? We were the workers, so our jobs were secure. In the 70s, when that changed, white flight created the suburbs, and those jobs at the Hewlett Packards, at the IBMs, they went from manufacturing, right, to more technology based, more information based, more service based. And so now, instead of the tools that we had to earn our living prior to integration, now those skills were not needed. So all through the 70s, we were our skills had become obsolete, and there was massive unemployment. And so it was the decline of black male viability in the economic system, because we didn't have degrees. We worked with our hands. We were mechanics. We were farmers, right? We did these things. Well, now those things were no longer desirable in a new economy that was created. So this created massive unemployment in all of the major cities for the black male. This is all documented. You can look it up. Massive unemployment. So this is when gangs started, right? Not started, but this is when they really started to take form in the 70s. This is where drugs really started to go rampant. This is where you see things like the rising of pimping, because the opportunities were taken away. Now people start to take advantage of one another. We start to cannibalize one another, because that's the only way that we can survive, right? So again, I said that chess, or it's about creating the environment. A system so this is the environment that was created, right? We can debate about who created it. This is the environment that was created. So all through the 70s, a generation of men had no viable employment opportunities, right? This is before affirmative action and all that stuff kicked in. So people, if they didn't want to hire us, they didn't have to hire us, right? There was massive unemployment. Drugs were rampant. People started to cannibalize one another. Now we go into the 1980s, right? And to add insult to injury, now there's an FBI operation to infiltrate black organizations that's trying to help. It's called COINTELPRO. It's all documented, right? They had they sent in moles. They sent in people to infiltrate, right, into organizations that were set up to do good. They would send somebody in to sell drugs to ruin the reputation of the entire organization, right? All of this stuff is documented, right? They would get one of the leaders of an organization. They would get him drugged and have him take pictures with all kind of women to mess up his reputation. All of these things are documented. So this is what's going on behind the scenes while we're trying to find employment and do all of these things. So this is the environment that we're in. And so we're in the 1980s, and now we have a second generation of men, right? And so now that we've become to the point now where we have to fight for these crumbs, right? We have to fight for these crumbs. So now we go from knowing who the enemy is during civil rights and being united to now we don't care who the enemy is, because now we have to compete with one another. So this is the decline of the family. So now, men are detached from the family, because now they have to go find employment in other cities, right? They have to do other things to find employment. So now we don't have stable communities anymore. At the same time, we are fighting one another. So this is the start of the decline of the community, right? We've been pitted against one another. We've been segregated in communities that are the least resourced. right? Due to things like redlining and all of the other ordinances that I talked about earlier. So we're isolated from economic opportunity in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. This is what's going on. And in the 90s, we make our final stand to say, we can't take this no more. We got to come together. And we have the Million Man March in 1995. A million black men come together. There's no issues. It's all love. We kumbaya. It's great. And then the very next year, our hip hop culture shifts from one that is multifaceted to something that's all about the identity of being a thug. And that is the start of the decline of the next generation of young men, because now we went from seeing these conditions and saying that they're unacceptable to now 30 years of glorifying those conditions. And so regardless of the type of beat or whatever, if you go listen to some of our top music over the past 25 to 30 years, the content has not evolved. That's not by accident. And so I started this whole talk off talking about how do we change our mindset? Because that's really what's important. How do we get to the point where we can change our mindset? Well, again, before we can understand how to change it, we have to realize where we've come from. And so within a span of 40 to 50 years, all of these things have contributed to us going from 80% two-parent households to 20% two-parent households. People always use this statistic, but nobody ever really chronologically shows us how it happened. But as resources were taken and our environment was dictated and controlled, once the environment is dictated and controlled, then you can predict the outcomes. And so if you put large groups of people in concentrated areas and then you withhold resources from them, you spread economic opportunity out away from where they are, you can reasonably determine that the majority of them are going to live a life of desperation. And that includes fighting one another. So they don't have to tell us to fight one another. All they have to do is create the environment, and the outcome is reasonably predicted. That's how you change the mindset of somebody, right? That's how you control somebody. That's how you use the art of war, right? I talked earlier. The art of war, the very first sentence in the art of war is all war is based on deception. All war is based on deception. It's not based on who's stronger. It's not based on who's more forceful. It's based on deception. And if we really want to understand why our conditions are the way they are, we have to understand how the system was created and how we actually get to the point where we change that behavior. So again, a system is based on behaviors. I just layered how that system was created, right? I just layered it out. I'm going to layer it out one more time, and then we're going to talk about solutions, right? Right after integration, resources started to be taken from our communities, right? We go from a manufacturing age to an industrial age. We go from taking a bus to work to now we have to drive 10, 15, 20 miles to work when we didn't have vehicles in the 60s and 70s. This created massive unemployment. And so when in the past men were known as the breadwinners and you could get a factory job and take care of your entire family, now those skills are no longer viable. And so the only men now that are competing are the ones with a college degree. Right? And so that shifts the mindset to I don't need to know how to work with my hands anymore. I don't need to know how to farm anymore. I don't need to know how to build things anymore. So the men in the 50s and the 60s, in the 70s, those men could build a house with their hands, right? Those men were skilled physically. They were laborers. That was their skill. All of my dad, my stepdad, all the men I know during that time, they could do anything. They could change it. They could do anything because this was how you made money. Well, in the 70s, right after integration, right after civil rights passed, we integrated. We started to move into those communities slowly, year after year. Well, the concept of white flight, which is what I did my thesis on in law school, was the idea that once the black population in any neighborhood or community got over a certain tipping point, typically that was about 8 to 10%. Once that happened, white neighbors got too uncomfortable that it was too many black people, and it started a snowball effect of them selling their homes. So what started to happen was after integration, we started to slowly move in those communities, and white families then started to move to the suburbs. The suburbs was not a thing in the 60s. The suburbs was created as a result of white flight. And what went with those white neighbors moving to the suburbs are the jobs. Because now we created the technology age. So now we're in a technology age where you need a college degree. You don't need to know how to farm. So the entire 70s created an environment of unemployment for men. That's the first layer of desperation. That's the first layer of the environment. You take away their ability to earn and you take away the resources. So now we isolated in these ghettos, in these parts of the city that are the most desolate, that are near dumping sites, that flood easily. We don't get to resources easily. This is where our communities are situated. And now the jobs aren't there anymore because now the factory is shut down. So now it becomes an eyesore and a place for crime. This is what was going on, right? So this created the desperation. After the desperation was created, you introduce drugs, right? You encourage gang activity. Crime rises out of desperation. Now we start to figure out the only way that we can make money is to take advantage of one another. And so this is where crime goes rampant. Because if you create an environment of desperation, people will turn on one another. They do experiments on this every day. They do them with mice. They do them with primates, right? Any group of animals, if you start to take away resources, they will eventually turn on one another. This is what was going on with our community in the 70s leading up to the 80s. So now you have an entire generation of men now that have been unemployed, have either given up and fallen to drugs, chosen a life of crime, looked for other means, but have been emasculated in that, right? And so now the second generation of men in the 80s, now they have a decision to make. Am I going to sell drugs and take advantage of this situation, or am I going to take drugs and be a victim, or am I going to look for another way out? But every day I walk out of my front door, there are no other opportunities. So this is the option I choose. So this is what's going on in the 80s and 90s. So when you're seeing this coming out, I remember coming home, we'd be coming home from church or even from school, and the guys right across the street, they hanging out, they got their chains on and their sunglasses. So imagine a kid seeing this every day. You're like, man, that looks cool, right? You're not seeing this on TV. You're seeing this right in your neighborhood, right? This the guy that, you know, if you go to the store, he puts some money in your pocket. My point is, right, you create this environment, right? The funny thing about this, I'm just thinking about this topic. The movie that just came out recently with Jamie Foxx about the clone. They cloned Tyrone. That's a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about, right? They create an environment that predicts certain outcomes and certain characters come as a result. And those are people that are going to take advantage of that environment. That's where you have the drug dealers, the pimps, the scam artists, right? These are people that, if given resources early on, maybe they wouldn't choose, right, to take advantage of it. But when you take resources away, these are people that are not just going to fall victim. They're going to find a way to victimize other people. And you increase that when you increase the desperation of a group of people. And this is what's going on. And so now we go from having respect for one another, being a community, to now we against one another. Right? So not only are we separating from our families, but we separating from one another. We in conflict now, right? The gang activity is at an all-time high in the 80s and 90s, right? We killing one another, right? Because we fighting for the same crumbs, because the economic resources have been taken from us. And now we are all in the same environment, and the majority are following the predictable outcomes. Right? You do this to any community, and the outcomes will be predictable. Right? If you go and look at the rise of the mafia and the Italians and how they were living and how they were treated early on, they were treated, I don't want to say as worse than us, but they were not looked at as first-class citizens for a long time. And their lack of resources is what increased the crime in their communities. This is not exclusive to us. The point is, the system is the environment. The environment was laid out, and layer after layer after layer, it has slowly destroyed. Because if you destroy a man in the community, if you destroy the viability of men, there's nothing. There's no defense, right? Because that's the last stand, right? That's the last stand. If all other things out the window, the men can defend their community, right, or their family, right? And they're willing to put it online. But if you remove the idea of the group, now you can infiltrate the community, right? So you create the environment, dictate the outcomes. Don't worry about the few that fall through the cracks, right? We'll deal with them. If they fall through the cracks, we'll find other ways to compromise them. That's a whole nother conversation. But we can dictate the majority. That's where we at. So when somebody asks how we got to this point, how we got to a point where our children are struggling to compete in the education system, they're falling behind at a fast clip, right? How do we get to the point where we still only control less than 3% of the wealth in this country? How do we get to a point where we control less wealth than we did 50 years ago, including home ownership? That really has not moved the needle or changed much at all. That's how we get to the point. Everything that I just talked about, that's how we get to that point, right? But this is where they messed up at. This new generation of young men, they about their business. This new generation of young men, I watch them, I see them as some guys that I listen to, they're about their business. And they're not just about it for themselves, right? And this is the thing, right? Because it's not everybody. People think for things to change, everybody got to change. It only takes a tipping point. It only takes a small majority of people who are committed, right, to changing and shifting an entire culture to do it. It only takes a tipping point. So it don't take the majority. But there's some young men out here and women. Let me not just categorize it to that. But the reason why I'm focusing on the young men is because I think that's the weakness that is going to change the collective economic viability of our community. Because I'm interested in the collective. I'm not interested in just individual financial success. I think we have the blueprint to that, right? And I think we know how to get money. We know how to get income. But wealth is different. Wealth is generational. For us to get to that point, we have to have a collective of strong men in our community, period. We can't just be looking for individual success, right? We have to be able to lift the tide. And the reason why that's important is because we need to reestablish a standard. We need to reestablish a standard. Some communities, some groups, they have a standard, right? That doesn't mean everybody meets the standard, but it's a certain expectation of how to live as a human being, right? A standard. We cannot just be anything goes. But in order for there to be a standard, there has to be strong men. That's just my opinion, right? But now that the system has been set, this is the question. This is the question. The system has been created. We can't change the system. We can't change the criminal justice system. We can't change the financial system. We can't change all of these systems. When I talk about systems, these are all institutions we can't change these systems. So how do you change our circumstances? The answer is we have to change our behavior. A large enough collective of us have to decide to change our behavior across the board. What we buy, where we shop, what we value, how we communicate with one another, how we interact, what we prioritize, what standards we set for our children, what expectations we have. We have to change our behaviors. The behaviors change, then the system collapses on itself, right? If we decided collectively for 1 week, we say collectively, we're not going to commit no crime in our community. No violent crime whatsoever. We're just going to have a drought. All of y'all beefing. We're just going to have a truce for 1 week. The entire criminal justice system will collapse on itself. Just because of our ability to withhold our desire to do wrong. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if just that declaration was enough to cut it in half by 50%, that would be enough to collapse it, right? A change in our behaviors. If we decided we're not buying, we're not, it doesn't even have to be, you know what? It doesn't even have to be that extreme. That's extreme, right? To get everybody across the country to say, okay, we're not going to commit any crime. That's extreme. If we just say collectively, you know what? We're not going to log on to any social media for 1 week until these things happen collectively. Do we not think that will be enough to have some kind of collective economic power, just a change in behavior? That would completely destroy the system, because that whole system is built on our collective eyes, right? They anticipate profits in trade securities based on how many eyeballs they anticipate to get over the next 10 years and how much ad revenue they're going to get from that. So a change in the behavior changes the system. right? So those are examples. Maybe those are extreme. But the point is, collectively, we have to have a standard of behaviors. Doesn't have to be complicated, but we have to have a standard of behaviors of how we interact with one another, how we treat one another, how we do business with one another, right? It doesn't have to do anything with any other groups of people or anybody else. It starts with how we connect and treat one another. Right now, we don't have a standard. There's no respect whatsoever. We have to set a standard of how we interact with one another. How do you change behaviors? The first thing you got to do is change influence. Family, your fathers, your mentors. We have to change what we're influenced by, right? If you're a parent, we have to take ownership of that as parents. We have to change the influence. That's how you change behavior. It is not enough to be a parent and allow social media or electronics to raise our children. It's just unacceptable. We have to change our influence. We have to change, right, who we spend our time with. All right, we got to change what's around us. We got to change what we listen to. We have to consciously do this, right? We have to say, I am not listening to this. My children are not hearing this. There's certain things I am not going to let my children have access to. We have to change what we are influenced by. That's one way to change behavior, right? Because it changes your mood. It changes your circumstance. It changes your environment. You have to change what you're influenced by. That's one way to change behavior. Another way is to change what we're motivated by. We can't just be motivated by money. We cannot just be motivated by material things, right? We have to understand those things do not validate us. Those things are not important. We have to change what we are motivated by. It's not easy to do. It's ingrained in our culture. So how do we do that? How do we change what we're motivated by? Right? We have to change our priorities, right? We cannot prioritize these material things that we think validate our identity, when really all they're doing is exploiting our insecurity. We got to change what motivates us. And at the apex of that, outside of our faith and our belief in God, needs to be our family. That's how you change somebody's motivation. Right? You give them, we have to help each other find our purpose. Right? That's how you change behavior. Right? You help people find purpose. Right? When a group of people is at the level of desperation, they don't have time to find purpose. They just trying to survive. Right? They just trying to survive. You don't have time to think about your purpose when you're just trying to eat, when you're struggling. That's why that environment was created, right? Because you don't have time to thrive. You just have to survive. All that's different now, though, because we're in the information age. See, back all of these times I was talking about earlier, the 60s, the 70s, 80s, at that time, information was held from us, right? It wasn't just easily accessible. It wasn't easily accessible to just pull up a computer and see how to start a business, right? How to take care of this tax loophole. None of this stuff was readily available in those time periods, right? This information was not accessible. So, what's different now is that we have information overload. We have too much information, and either we just have analysis by paralysis, or we don't know what to believe. We don't know what's right. So in the past, they would withhold information from us for thousands of years. That's even what happened in the Catholic Church. You know, at one point in history, it was illegal to own a Bible. The only people that could own a Bible was the church. They controlled what was in the Bible. You couldn't just go read it for yourself. They controlled access to information. That's what happened. But now we're in the the artificial intelligence, the digital age, where now we have access to everything. Everything is available. And so now the trick is not to withhold it, is to give you so much information you don't know what's true. That's how it's done now. I'm gonna give you so much information, give you information overload, you don't know what's true. So if you find out the truth, that's on you. But I'm not gonna make it easy for you to find. So now if you go and Google something, it used to be when you Google something, the most reputable sites were the first sites to come up, right? If I'm Googling, so, what is this, or where did this start, or just some fact or something I'm trying to figure out or learn about, the most reputable sites will come up. Now when you Google something, the first thing that comes up are YouTube videos. But there's no reference to where that YouTube video got its information. So I'm going to Google to go to a YouTube video. I go watch the YouTube video and I see something interesting. I say, well, let me go Google it. I go Google it and it sends me back to another YouTube page. So now I'm just in a loop of information and I don't know what's right. And for me to actually find the most reputable sites, it's not at the top of the page anymore. I have to go down and scroll down and really use some due diligence to figure out the answer. Right? It's information overload. That's deception. What did I say earlier? Deception. All warfare is based on deception. That's the first sentence in the art of war. I don't know how I got off on that tangent. But the question we're answering now is, how do we change behavior? That's what I care about. How do we change our... You can't change the system. You cannot change the system. But you can change behavior. How do we change that behavior? We got to change what we're influenced by. We got to change our environment. Right. You're right. They distract people with reality TV. We all are distracted. Distractions at this point are more easily accessible than productivity. It's nothing but distractions. But we have a decision to make. Do we want to keep being distracted, or do we want to change our mindset? A number was done on us. I just walked you through 4 or 5 decades of things that were done to us. I didn't even talk about the crime bill, right? And I went into no whole nother generation of men, right, were put in prison. This is a lot of the millennials and the zennials. That's their fathers. They were put in prison. These are the guys that I looked up to, when I was growing up. These were my big cousins and big brothers. They wiped out that generation. I mean, a lot of them went to jail. They got killed. But these guys, man, I'm just thinking back. We didn't even talk about that, But we talked about how bad the, drugs decimated the communities, and then what was not decimated through death, through murder, through drug addiction, now was swept up and sent to prison, right? This all was going on in the 90s. This started, the crime bill was signed right at the same time as the Million Man March, right? All of this timing correlates. So you got the crime bill, right? You have this whole shift in our music, in our culture, right? Where we go from this conglomerate of hip hop culture that represented all these different things, including gangster rap music, to now it's all about gangster rap music and being a thug. And that's what it has been for almost 30 years, right? That's been at the forefront. And it depleted the mindset of our men, right? And so you have a whole fatherless generation of men who have had 20 to 30 years of reprogramming of what it is to be a man, right? In that being a man is about making money, right? It's about doing all of these illicit things, right? There's nothing about integrity, nothing about respect, nothing about what actually it means to be a man. But there was nobody that'll tell them. So they were able to create their own definition. And so now that definition has become what a lot of our young men have aspired to. And that's what we need to change. That's what we need to change. It's not about how much money we make. It's not about how successful we become financially individually. If we are going to change the collective circumstances of our community, we got to change our collective mindset. And the only way to do that in the systems that we cannot change is to change our behavior. So I'll see y'all on Friday. I think I'm going to go live again. I enjoyed doing this. So yeah, I got a lot to talk about, a lot of stuff on my mind. So I'll do this again. I'll go live again on Friday, and I'm gonna start making this a regular thing because I think it's an important conversation, and a lot of things that I'm talking about I don't think are being addressed. So you got the right one. See y'all later.